And we are live. Good evening and welcome to the Philosophical Cafe, our voluntary project to bring philosophy to larger audiences. Tonight is episode 81 of the Philosophical Cafe, and it's also episode 3 of our series Excommunicating Philosophy. And tonight we are going to talk about Descartes, René Descartes, the very same that you might have heard in courses of history of philosophy as being the father of modern philosophy. Or you might have heard his famous saying, "I think, therefore I am." René Descartes is usually pictured on the good side of the scientific revolution, safely on the grounds of modernity. But tonight we are going to try to show you that things are never so simple, that Descartes had to navigate deep and troubled waters of religion and politics in the 17th century, and even his writings were not so securely on the side of the winners as you might believe. Joining me tonight are two world-leading experts on Cartesian philosophy, then Garber and Vlad Alexandrescu. And with me moderating tonight is Grigore Vida, who is a third expert on Descartes. Among so many Cartesians, I will be the one who will ask the dumb, general, stupid questions. Hoping to bring the discussion back or down from the clouds of metaphysics into the everyday life of people who are interested in the history of ideas. Perhaps we have with us, as usual, two audiences, one on Zoom, made of friends and also Cartesians and students of Descartes, and one on YouTube, more general, but also made of friends and made of students, made of friends of Philosophical Cafe. And let me remind you that I'm eagerly expecting questions from both our audiences. And especially don't let me ask all the stupid questions. Join me in asking general questions. But let me begin nevertheless. I would like to ask our guests tonight to give us, to fill in some of the gaps that we might have in our knowledge of Descartes, if what we know about Descartes is that he was the father of modern philosophy and the author of Meditations. What else was Descartes apart from this? Give some of your favorite stories about Descartes. Then Garber. You need to switch on the microphone this time.
Thank you very, very much, Donna. It's an enormous pleasure to be here and to be talking about Descartes. First, about the question of Descartes as the father of modern philosophy, and what that means. I think first it's interesting to point out that when Descartes started writing, he was not the father of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy, well, first of all, what do we mean by modern philosophy? There was an established philosophy that probably begins in the 13th century with figures like St. Thomas Aquinas, goes through the Middle Ages with figures like Occam and Scotus, and then into the 16th and early 17th century with lesser known figures like Suarez, for example, but who were enormously important for their contemporaries. And this is a philosophy that was built largely around the philosophy of Aristotle, which was not at all uncontroversial when St. Thomas began teaching it, but by the 16th century had become sort of the standard fare that everybody learned in school, and was very closely associated with the church. At first, of course, the Catholic Church, but later on in the 16th century with Protestant sects, particularly Lutheranism and Calvinism. The people who were considered the moderns were the people who rebelled against that and who offered an alternative to that, which was considered enormously dangerous, because by the time you get to the 16th century, the official philosophy had become thoroughly intertwined with religious doctrine. You know, issues particularly like the Eucharist, transubstantiation, the resurrection of the body, the idea of Christ as embodied, and so on. All of these things and many more were deeply intertwined with this particular Aristotelian philosophical program. The Aristotelian philosophy had always been controversial, but by the end of the 16th century, there was a movement of people who wanted to replace it. At first, Descartes was just one of many people who wanted to replace the modern philosophy, the established philosophy, who wanted to challenge the authority of not merely to replace the philosophy, but to challenge the authority of the teachers, and through that seemed to challenge the authority of the church. He doesn't become the father of modern philosophy until later in the century, when a lot of these earlier figures get forgotten, and Descartes becomes, in a certain way, the face of modern philosophy. We think of him now, when you learn about him, in your philosophy class, in your general sort of intellectual history class, we think of him in terms of cogito ergo sum, the emphasis on the individual and the certainty of our knowledge of ourselves, and so on. For his contemporaries, he certainly was known for that, but he was also a tremendously innovative natural philosopher. That's to say, physicist. Descartes really invented the modern idea of the laws of nature. He was the first to he was not the first to think of what a law of nature was, but he was one of the first to actually propose laws of nature and to propose definite, say, laws of impact of bodies. He offered an explanation for why it is that the planets went around the sun. That's to say, he was broadly Copernican, and he worried about the mechanism that ultimately Newton was to discover in the theory of gravitation. But the Cartesian account was enormously important. And in medicine and human biology, he offered a picture of the human body, and in fact animal bodies in general, that made them objects in exactly the same way as machines are, and objects that worked in exactly the same way that machines did, which revolutionized the way in which people thought of themselves and their place in nature. So it wasn't just, it wasn't just the cogito. It wasn't just, answering doubt. It was an entire system of philosophy, an entire system of natural sciences that was an alternative to what it is that people have been teaching for many years before, and alternative to what it is that had become sort of the authoritative views.
I would like to ask Vlad the same question. What is your favorite story about Descartes?
It's difficult to say. Thank you very much for this question. So I think that Descartes was in the beginning not an established person, established philosopher. And he fled away from France. He get to the Province Unie, to Holland, to North Holland, and become a more isolated figure, maybe also in a retreat, in an intellectual retreat. There he achieved to touch to many disciplines of science and to philosophy in general, and to ask himself the main questions of philosophy: if God exists, if he as a soul exists, in responding also to claim of the Catholic Church, of the Catholic theologians, which made appeal to philosophers in order to prove two things: the existence of God and the immortality of soul. So, as a good son of the Catholic Church, Descartes attempted to do these tasks, to achieve these tasks, and to offer a personal answer to these questions: the demonstration of the existence of God and the demonstration of the immortality of the soul. That was also the reason for which the first edition of the meditations, of the metaphysical meditations, had this false subtitle, the demonstration of the immortality of the soul. So Descartes does not demonstrate, properly speaking, the immortality of the soul, but he made a room, I think, for this perspective. So he was more isolated at the beginning of his philosophical career, but he achieved to establish a network, a very important network, through his correspondence with the whole learned Europe. Of course, in employing also some mediators, such as Marat Mersenne, who was in Paris and was his principal correspondent until 1649, but also through other people, through Netherlands people, through Frenchmen, through Italian also. And so he became a sort of center of the learned Europe, but not being part of the establishment. That is very important to know about Descartes. He never made a regular university curriculum. He had only a jura diploma, but not a philosophical diploma on the university, and not a theological diploma. That's very important. So he was not part of the establishment. He was never a university professor. He was never a teacher in an official establishment. He was not part of the establishment, and that situates Descartes in a tradition which has roots in Italy, in the Renaissance Italy, but which will continue in France and in Europe in general in the early modern period. So he became he became a center. I said he became a center of Europe through the polemics, through the dialogue, through the correspondence, which placed him at the center of a network and of replies, of objections, of replies, of private letters, of duties, which made him a very central figure of philosophy and of science in Europe. He had also some disciples, and some of them were university professors. Some of them were only private learned people, learned persons who spread around Cartesianism and many of his scientific ideas. And I think he became so a model of a private person, which spread private science and philosophy. But this private science and philosophy became more and more important and attained more and more the university curricula. And that's part of the story. I mean, the Cartesianism which influenced very much the university curriculum, and who struggled with the official, with the established theological and philosophical curriculum.
Let me ask you the following. So in the 17th century, when someone tried something new on his own as an outsider, he usually got in trouble. We saw how Galileo got in trouble. We saw how Spinoza got in trouble. How did Descartes get in trouble then, Garber? You need to switch on the microphone.
Descartes got in trouble with everybody. But let me begin by going back, a little bit. Descartes, when he was young, was very bold, and his view was, and he tells the story in part one of the Discourse on the Method, which is a wonderful piece of literature, about how as a young man he went to school hoping that he would learn all of these marvelous things from these wonderful teachers, but after finishing the course of study, realized they didn't really know anything. And so as soon as he possibly could, he tells the reader, he left school to go out into the world, to start philosophy anew. A bold project of rejecting everything that he had learned and starting everything anew. The works that we have begin with a treatise on method that he never finished. He wrote then a treatise on metaphysics, which corresponds to, which is supposed to correspond to the Meditations, which is the one that begins with the doubt and the cogito argument. And then he sketched out a whole physics. And then Galileo got condemned. And when Descartes found out about that, he realized the danger that he was in presenting new ideas and the possibility for real disaster. So he withdrew all of the works from publication. None of those works that he had worked on were published in that form during his lifetime. He initially decided that he was going to publish nothing. Within a few years, so within a couple of years, he decided, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. He seriously believed that he had a new philosophy that was going to change everything. And he was very eager to share it. But what he did was he put it in a form that would hide the originality, that would not be as sort of obviously in contradiction with the established philosophy. And he published a book. He published a book that consisted of 3 essays. The geometry, where he presented his analytic geometry and his new algebra. The meteors, where he talked about terrestrial physics, and the dioptrics, where he talked about optical physics. And the introduction to that was the discourse on the method. That actually worked pretty well. He did get some criticism from people, but there's a remarkable letter from somebody who was committed to the standard philosophy, who wrote Descartes and said, "I thought that you were, this real opponent of Aristotelianism, and when I read your book, I can see that that's absolutely wrong." Descartes was absolutely charmed. It had worked. He had managed to hide the originality. Then he figured, well, since that work was published and seemed to be accepted so well, he would begin to actually publish the full system, beginning with the meditations, the metaphysics. Beginning with the cogito, I exist, from which the rest of the world is going to be built on the basis of me. And to make sure that it was read properly, and to make sure that people wouldn't think he was going beyond the bounds of propriety, he and his friend Mersenne chose a number of people who would write from different points of view. A couple from the universities, a couple people like Thomas Hobbes, for example, from outside the universities, who would write criticisms and evaluations of the theses, and Descartes would answer them. A very controlled sort of entry into the world, where he would present his real ideas, but in a way in which maybe people would realize that they're not so radical if all of these different people can approve of them. He had some disagreements with these people, but it worked pretty well. And then, as they say, all hell broke loose. What happened was, he was in the Netherlands, whereas Vlad said he had moved fairly early on. And there was a young man named Henricus Regis, who had become a great fan of his on the basis of the publication, first of the discourse and the essays, and then on the basis of the meditations. He was a professor of medicine at the University of Utrecht. And he gave a series of lectures at the University of Utrecht, where he mentioned Descartes specifically and thanked Descartes specifically, but where he seemed to overstep certain boundaries. And that's when it is that Descartes began to get into real trouble. The Faculty of Theology was outraged, particularly the rector, a guy named Gisbertus Pucius, or Foot, literally foot in Dutch, who opposed it very strongly. And Descartes was a little concerned. He advised Regis, to be very careful about what he said. The issues were, for example, one of the big issues, for example, was in Descartes, the mind and the body are separate substances and can exist apart from one another. And Regis said that they were an accidental union. And it was like, putting a coffee cup on a table or something like that. Two things that were accidentally united to one another. That caused a great deal of trouble if you think about doctrines like the embodiment of Christ. If you think of doctrines like the resurrection of the body and so on. If these are just accidentally connected, mind and body are just accidentally connected, that can lead to trouble. He also was much more explicitly anti-Aristotelian than Descartes dared to be. And he was representing this as Descartes' opinion, which it really was. Well, not the accidental union, perhaps, but at that point, all hell broke loose. There were pamphlets written against Descartes. There were riots in the lecture halls. Some of the students were absolutely delighted at the idea of, the way students are now, at somebody who was against authority and saying something that they were forbidden to say. Other students were scandalized. There were fights between the professors, and ultimately pamphlet wars, and ultimately court cases where it was forbidden to mention the name of Descartes in the university, that began, Descartes in a certain sense the battle. But at the same time, I would argue that's what began the process that ultimately made Descartes recognized as the father of modern philosophy. It was these sorts of battles that put the name of Descartes on everybody's lips and made, there's nothing that makes people want to read a book more than somebody like Descartes saying, you're not allowed to read this book. And so in the Netherlands, he became, the celebrated cause on both sides, for the conservatives as a representative of what people shouldn't be doing. But on the other hand, for I think many of the students and many of the more liberal-minded academics and intellectuals, eventually, people like Spinoza, model for what it is that they should be doing.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Descartes seems to be aware that negative publicity is actually good publicity, because he writes to Regis at some point. So Regis just gave a first reply to Voetius, and his reply was banned. And so Descartes writes to Regis that the ban of your book had no other effect but increasing the desire to buy it and to study it more attentively.
Yes, absolutely.
So do you think that Descartes maybe did this being aware that this, let's say, negative publicity is actually good for his reputation? Or it was somehow unintended?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. He, I think he had been very careful before then. And what he tells Regis in one of those letters where he's giving Regis advice is, do like me. Don't explicitly say that you're against all of these sort of traditional ideas. People will figure it out eventually. But if you say it too boldly, you'll just get them angry and you'll get into trouble. And he was obviously very rattled by Galileo's condemnation. Right. That's why he withdrew his earlier works. But at the same time, and his initial publication or the publication of the meditations with the objections and replies was very controlled. He wanted to present himself in a way that would be both new, but at the same time, not so new that it would get people angry. He was, I think, kind of upset by the fact that there was this enormous reaction to him. He had lost control, but at the same time, I'm sure that he was pleased that everybody was talking about him. And he certainly did not have a high opinion of the people who were saying negative things about him, that he would worry about that. So yeah, it was a little bit of both. It was a little bit of both, I think.
But let's add a bit of a context. So Descartes was Catholic, and Vlad suggested that he was kind of hiding in Holland.
Right.
And Catholics were, the French Catholics. He was probably Galileo was condemned by the Catholic Church. So I imagine that Descartes was more concerned with the possible Catholic condemnation. And he didn't foresee that Protestant countries, especially Dutch faculties, are going to start the trouble, are they? Was that a kind of miscalculation on his part, I wonder? Vlad, how do you read this episode of pamphlets and accusations and the first condemnation of Descartes' name?
So Descartes relied, of course, on Catholic Church, understanding, and he tried to obtain the approval of the professors of the Sorbonne in Paris for the publication of the meditations. It's not very clear if he obtained or not. He obtained something, but maybe not quite an official approval. But this approval was marked on the first page on the meditations. So let's take it from here. The meditations, which appeared with the name, Descartes' name on the front page, while Discours de la Méthode was published anonymously in The Hague. So it was a very important thing that the meditations appeared in Amsterdam and then in Paris with this approval. But very soon, of course, some of the Jesuits were not very happy with some things in the meditation, some theological things in the meditations. And with the seventh objections to the meditation, which were due to the Father Bourdin, the trouble began. But also in Holland, in 1643, so 2 years after the publication of the meditations, trouble began with the Admiranda Methodus, which was a book, a book written by Voetius and by Martin Schock, which a book in which the authors reproached to Descartes many things, and these many things were, of course, theological things, but not in the first sight theological things. That's very interesting. The main reproach was physical things, medical, new conceptions, and that's very interesting that the new physics of Descartes challenged the medical practice and the medical savoir of the 17th century. So he made trouble in the medical orders, and that were practical things, and relying with money and with influence, and it troubled many circuits. So in the first line, there were other things which became not acceptable, and of course some philosophical things which could be read against theological dogmas. We have the separation of the body and of the soul, which was not a main idea. I mean, everybody knew, everybody thought that the soul was immortal and the body was mortal. But the way in which the body and the soul cooperated, were united, the Cartesian model was very different and not acceptable at all. I mean, this dualist conception and the idea that the soul could be thought as a complete separate substance without extension, that was the problem, without extension, was very hard to accept. And so progressively, theological issues appeared. And on this ground, Descartes was in a big trouble, not only for his philosophical ideas, but also for the orthodoxy of his philosophy. And we know today that arguments that exposed someone's philosophy as heretical, or possibly not in accordance with Catholic or with Protestant faith, were lethal, were totally. I mean, they could eliminate, they could cancel a figure, and the struggle for Descartes became not to be cancelled by Protestants, but not also to be cancelled by Jesuits, but by Oratorians. Or this struggle survived to Descartes' death. I mean, official condemnations of Cartesianism in the Catholic Church appear later. But we have also among us Roger Ariev, who wrote a very interesting chapter in his book on the Cartesian condemnations of, Catholic condemnations of Cartesianism, and maybe he would add something to this.
Roger, fill in some gaps in our story. You will need to switch on the microphone.
You're asking me to fill in a gap?
How was the condemnation taking place? Why? What was the reason, and how did it happen?
Well, so far it's been quite good. I mean, the dialogue between Dan Garber and Vlad Alexandrescu has been quite rich with problems in the Netherlands, and then after the problems in the Netherlands, after the death of Descartes, you get also problems in France, in the Catholic Church, but they're actually connected. In fact, they're connected by the Low Countries, but basically in Belgium. So the Catholic troubles begin fairly early, around 1662 at Leiden. At Leuven, at Louvain. There were problems at Leiden before then, That's not Belgian. But so what happens is that they really were Cartesians, and then the Cartesians, independently of Descartes, were a little bit more uppity, as it were, more vocal about their Cartesianism and their and their ideas that didn't perfectly cohere with the Catholic Church. And so from Louvain, you get letters to Rome, which then provoke the censure of Rome, so that the Descartes' work gets put on the index, and then the kind of the French authorities come into play, given that, and start individually banning Descartes from being taught at the University of Paris, and it spreads. And so by the end of the century, you've got general condemnations of Cartesianism as being a kind of a philosophy that could confuse the mysteries of the Catholic faith, which is essentially the way that the king puts his ban of condemnation of Cartesianism from being taught in the schools. And you get priests who were teaching what the authorities found to be Cartesian, fired from their jobs. And it becomes a kind of an outside the school, inside the school thing, until you find more Cartesians in the school that are able to navigate these treacherous waters. But yeah, the condemnations start in the Netherlands with in the 40s and the 50s. Descartes dies in the 50s, and then you see a little bit of a peace for a while, and then the issues are reborn. But they come from the Netherlands to France, and then it's spread. Is that a little piece to fill in? But I mean, I find both accounts by Dan and Vlad persuasive.
Can I just add something, an amusing sort of perspective on this story? I mean, you raised the question, Donna, about, was Descartes surprised by the reaction from the Protestants as opposed from the Catholics? In the middle of this dispute at Utrecht, after Vlad pointed out the reaction from the Jesuits in the seventh reply, the seventh objections, Bourdin, which was added a little bit later. Descartes writes a long letter to the head of the Jesuits in France. First of all, they complain about this guy who was criticizing him. Descartes did not like to be criticized. But second of all, to inform them about the terrible treatment that he's getting among the Protestants, and to say, here I am, a good Catholic kid in the Netherlands. After all, my meditations were approved by the Sorbonne, sort of, and and here they're treating me so badly. They're beating me up, and won't you come to my defense? It will be, I mean, what I emphasize what Roger said. It will be almost 20 years later before he gets into trouble with the Catholic Church, which is very, very interesting. I mean, the first reactions are from the Protestants in the Netherlands, and there we're talking about 1641, 1642, or 1640 actually, 41, 42. The incident at Louvain that Roger alluded to is 1662, which is 20 years later. It's interesting that it takes so long for the Catholic, and the actual putting of Descartes' works on the index is 1667, which is even later. The incident at Louvain is in a way the beginning that eventually leads up to what it is that happens in Rome with the index. But still, you're talking now 25 years later, after the initial reaction from the Protestants, by which time Cartesianism had become sort of regularized in at least the Netherlands and in Germany. And there were professors at, maybe not in Utrecht, but professors at Leiden who were teaching Cartesianism, who were openly sympathetic to Cartesianism. And it had become, and certainly people outside of the universities were widely reading and discussing it. I'm thinking here of the Circle of Spinoza. Descartes' works were available in the 1650s in Dutch translations, suggesting that people who couldn't read Latin, which is to say, people who were outside the university, were interested in reading and talking about Descartes. When a publisher publishes a dozen different titles of Descartes in Dutch translation, that suggests that somebody's out there buying them and presumably reading them and talking about them, you know. And it isn't until really later, I think, that that happens in France, and that the Catholic Church becomes involved in condemning Descartes. Why that happens, I really don't know. I mean, Roger, do you have any ideas why there is that gap?
Well, I mean, what I find interesting, of course, is that the index, putting Descartes' works on index by the Catholic Church, included putting the letter to Diné on the index. I mean, so they didn't like any of that, and of course the Church is, in a sense, a scholarly kind of process, has a scholarly process of looking, of getting subcommittees to look at the thing, and it takes a while, and they study it. But there are, in fact, condemnations, though not official ones, in France before then. So the main Jesuit college is in Paris, had disputations that made fun of the Cartesians very early. 1550s, you did mention Bourdin, whose criticism of the Meditations was published in his objections and Descartes' replies in 1642. But even before then, he had criticisms. He had what Descartes thought was outrageous criticism of the optics that was published in the Discourse on Method, and it was done in the form of student debates and with kind of like ad hominems to Descartes. So there are little things that we can pick up together, but there's no kind of, and one has to always remember, of course, that Descartes saying, well, the Sorbonne supports me, and that doesn't make it any better for the Jesuits, because the Jesuits were the rivals to the Sorbonne across the street with a separate educational system, and no theologian in the Sorbonne could be a Jesuit. In fact, they weren't, and so they would. The Jesuits were free to attack. At the same time, they were also worried about attacking one of theirs, because Descartes was a student of the Jesuits, and they didn't want to simply. He was careful enough to cultivate them at that point, and to say that to point out that he's one of their students, and this is the fruits of their teaching. And so it took a while before it took Descartes' death, and then a little bit of study and a little bit more. But there are occasions in between, so it's not wholly pure. And of course it is Voetius, who accused Descartes of being an atheist, right? Which is wonderful, and that's because of the meditations, doubting the existence of God or thinking that God could be a deceiver. That's what an atheist does. Descartes, in return, accused Voetius of being an atheist, and then Voetius accused Descartes of being a slanderer, and all that went to court. And Descartes was about to be arrested when he asked the diplomats, the French diplomats, to intercede, the embassy of the king ambassador to intercede, and the thing was quiet, and he didn't go to jail. But he got serious. Descartes did get in trouble in the Netherlands, but he died before getting in trouble in France, getting into big trouble in France.
Had he lived longer, he might have.
He probably would.
But you mentioned the outrageous criticisms that Descartes thought Bourdin had made of the dioptrics. Just as an open question, do you think that Descartes thought that there was any criticism of Descartes that he would have thought wasn't outrageous?
Do you want Vlad to answer that, or I can give you my 2 cents?
No, I would argue that Descartes was not so scandalous, and I rely on one of your study, Roger, when you say that finally Descartes was the adept, the tenant of the void, of the non-existence of the void. So as Aristotle was. And some of the new Aristotelians were moderate on this issue, were more relative. So Descartes was very opposed, for example, to Pascal, who experimented and made the void more acceptable for the general opinion. So not only he was against the existence of the void, but he gave a sort of explanation of the movement which relied on the non-existence of the void and of the general, movement of bodies which abhorred void in some respect. So it's true that some physical and cosmological views of Descartes were a little bit strange, such as these elements, 3 kinds of elements. And I read this afternoon, I reread the Admiranda Methodus of Voetius, which is a great text. Voetius says, how could you know that there is different figures and different dimensions of the 3 elements of the corpuscles of the 3 elements? You cannot see them. You cannot experiment them. So it's only imagination, only totally out of the blue, this question. So and also this interesting point of a very small point which has dimensions, which has a figure for Descartes. The corpuscle has a figure, but being divisible. So the figure is quite small and quite characteristic, but the figure is also divisible and divisible and divisible. So it was not acceptable. And I think that for many reasons, Descartes was very provocative. And some people, which of course pertain to the established system, became very critical. I mean, now, today, we see Descartes as a leading figure, as the father of modernity, etc., etc. But at this time, at that time, it was not very clear.
When Voetius accuses Descartes of atheism, it's certainly a different understanding from what atheism means today. Could you say a little bit what atheism meant in the 17th century, then maybe? In what sense could Voetius say about Descartes that he was an atheist when Descartes gave the famous demonstrations for the existence of God? In what sense could he be an atheist?
Can I
Yeah, sure, Dan.
comment on that? I think Alan Force, sort of a historian of atheism and free thinking in 17th and 18th centuries, has a very interesting observation about the about what atheism meant, and it didn't mean literally not believing in God, but it was a term of general criticism for people whose conception of God was different from yours. So, from the point of view of Catholic, you know, Luther was an atheist because his conception of God was different. Or Calvinist was an atheist. Calvin was an atheist. And so I'm sure it is the case that Descartes' conception of God was different than Voetius's. But and because of that, that theological difference was sufficient for people to say that, for somebody like Voetius to say that Descartes was an atheist. And it comes up with Spinoza again. God is at the center of Spinoza's ethics. And Spinoza denies explicitly in his letters, and I think quite honestly, that he is an atheist. On the other hand, he certainly was read by many people in the period as an atheist.
Stephen has a question. Stephen, would you like to say it aloud?
Sure. Hey, Dan, Vlad, Roger, everybody, Donna. I was wondering if you'd be interested in speculating a bit, since we're talking about Descartes as a heretic, speculating a bit on what Descartes' reaction would have been to being placed on the index of prohibited books until corrected.
After his death, right?
After.
Yeah, 1663, so 13 years later.
After his death, yes.
So what would have said had he known?
What who have said? What he said, what he also said. I mean, I think the main objection, theological objection to Descartes' view of God was the way of demonstrating the existence of God in the second meditation, not in the third, but in the second meditation. I mean, the idea, this idea to that we can expel all the what we think and what we the entire luggage of faith. And then the hypothesis of the malin génie, of the evil genius. That was, even if it is an artifice, a way of putting a trick, a bizarre argument. It was not acceptable. I mean, to think only for one second that the creator of the universe could be not only a deceiver, but a malin génie was, totally unacceptable. And I think also that part of the arguments against Descartes were on the fact that Descartes was seen as a person who perverted youth, who perverted the people and students and adolescents, a person who were not very aware of all the technical instruments of philosophy. And in this respect, I think it can be compared with Socrates, with the reproach made to Socrates to pervert the youth, to pervert the mind of the youth. And Descartes, of course, replied to this reproach, but the thing remained, and I think remained also after his death.
But I would like to ask you a sort of more general question that we discussed about the condemnation of Galileo, and we discussed about the excommunication of Spinoza. And my feeling there was that there was a certain unavailability, that they got into trouble, there was nothing to be done. They were not really, in the case of Spinoza, Stephen and Isaac persuaded us that Spinoza actually looked for it, or in any case, he didn't bother, really didn't care. In the case of Galileo, it's a bit more complex, but in the case of Descartes, however, you were saying, and I would like to know more about that Descartes was very careful from very beginning, and he wanted to avoid this at all costs. And still, he couldn't. He couldn't because it couldn't have been avoided, because philosophy is bound to get in trouble with the established authorities and be accused of atheism.
No, I think you have to look at the circumstances. What got Descartes condemned was not anything Descartes said directly himself, but what Regis said. That's what got him started. Well, okay, in the Protestant case, in the case of the problems at Utrecht, it was Regis, who was an enthusiastic follower, who was willing to be more provocative than Descartes himself was willing to be. That got him in trouble, that got Descartes in trouble. Originally, Fiscius was attacking Regis, but eventually, as the affair went on, he turned his attention at that point to Descartes. That was Vlad had mentioned the Admiranda Methodist, the book that Schuck/Fiscius had written, against Descartes. But it was originally had Regis not sort of stuck his neck out, I'm not sure that there would have been that kind of reaction to Descartes in the Netherlands. And had there not been that affair, I wonder if Descartes would, if Cartesianism would have become the controversial affair all over Europe that it eventually did become. I see that as really the moment at which, you know, the condemnations begin, but also Descartes' fame begins.
Yeah,
Maybe
Dan, you are right. At the beginning, the Utrecht crisis was an internal affair of the university.
Right.
I mean, Voetius would not accept that Cartesianism enter into the university, and Cartesianism entered into the university through Regius, who
Yes.
overlapped his chair. His chair was a chair of medicine, and
Right.
instead of doing medicine, he did natural philosophy and a little bit metaphysics, and so he overlapped to the other curricula, and it was not acceptable. But then Descartes replied, secured his position and replied to Voetius. And this became a public affair, not only an internal affair, but a public affair. And the French ambassador was implied. Constantine Huygens, who was personal advisor to the regent of the state, was implied. Everybody cooperated to this. And then it was also another crisis, the Leiden crisis, which is also very interesting.
Right.
The Leiden crisis is more metaphysical. I mean, there are more metaphysical arguments implied. Very interesting, also, and theological.
But let me understand better what you're saying. So you're basically saying that Descartes was condemned for being too popular, that he was not condemned for what he said or wrote, but he was condemned because he was dangerously popular.
Not popular, but
became popular.
accepted in the university. That was the problem. I mean, not in the university. Descartes, okay, but not in the university. When Descartes entered into university, this is a problem, and he has to be cancelled. So
maybe one could say that not the Descartes' philosophy per se was dangerous, but the path that he opened or the consequences were dangerous. Take Henry More, for instance. He's initially a Cartesian, but at some point he realizes that Descartes opens a path that can be dangerous. Am I correct in saying this?
I think so, but I think there's also a personal element as well. A wonderful essay by Alan Gabby about Henry More and Descartes. You know, he was enormously enthusiastic about Descartes when he first.
Now you move to England, yeah? Henry More is someone.
Now we're moving to England, yeah. More remains actually deeply influenced by Descartes, I think, throughout. But one of the key moments is when, that according to Gabby, is when, as I remember the article, is when More discovers a draft of a letter that Descartes had written in reply to a letter that More had written to Descartes, where he is very dismissive of some of More's comments. And I think that, and the implication is that More was deeply hurt by that. And even though he remains in a certain sense as Cartesian as he always was, he always disagreed with certain aspects of Descartes, even in the initial letters where he was very enthusiastic about him. But still, I mean, there were elements of Cartesianism that More accepted as well. But I think some of the hostility to Descartes was really personal. Even when he's disagreeing with him, he says Descartes should be taught in all of the universities.
Yeah, but Descartes can lead to Spinoza also, which is certainly the wrong way.
If you read it in a certain way, yes, absolutely.
I wanted also to ask, we know that the ban on Galileo was lifted in 1992 or so. The ban on Spinoza was not lifted up until today. Did someone ever feel the need of lifting the ban on Descartes in the Catholic Church? Or it became he's too much of a classic to such a
Or
need.
were his writings corrected?
I don't think his writings were ever corrected. I don't know. Did anybody? What is the status at this point? The index is no longer, as I understand it, the index is no longer an official ban, but that's only fairly recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, I think. Somebody can correct me who knows the current state of the Catholic Church better than I do. But even so, I mean, Descartes, it certainly did not prevent French scholars from reading, commenting, and writing on Descartes, you know, from the 17th century up until the day before yesterday. It never really stopped people from reading Descartes. Was he up until the very end still on the index? Let me get my copy of the index. That's a very good question. I'll take you just a moment.
Right. So Dan Garber has a copy of the index of forbidden books on his own desk.
Depends upon what year. Could we add the fact that there are political elements in the condemnation of Descartes, both in the Netherlands and in France, but they're different. So in France in particular, the Jesuit found it expedient to attack not just Descartes, but to attack the other Catholics, namely the Jansenists, the people they call the Jansenists, and the Oratorians. And so attacking, they found out that Oratorians were teaching Descartes philosophy in their schools. And so they were able to put pressure and dominate the Oratorians as they were trying to dominate the Jansenists, Arnaud being one of the Port-Royalists that they thought was a representative of the Jansenists and a Cartesian. So they could actually attack the Jansenists and the Oratorians by attacking Descartes. So they could embarrass them. There were court cases where professors, Oratorians, were expelled for teaching Descartes against the orders of the king. And the orders of the king were suggested to the king by his Jesuit confessor. So the Jesuits, a very political group, were able to attack the Oratorians and their enemies, the Jansenists, through their attack of their formal attack of Descartes. In the same way, in the Netherlands, it's not so much a doctrinal thing between members of the Catholic Church, but Vossius had no problem he's a minister, a Protestant minister, an important Protestant minister. The main person at Utrecht, the not the dean, but above the dean of the School of Theology and of the whole of the university, and he's attacking a foreigner, a Catholic, a nobody, and he can't possibly lose. Descartes didn't a little too naive to see that he couldn't possibly get a political victory over him, and in order to get a victory of any kind over him, he really did require the whole machinery of the diplomacy of his high-placed friends in the Catholic in the embassy of France and in the Prince of Orange retinue. So there are political elements in philosophers getting in trouble, and Descartes may be a little naive in his thinking that reason is going to convince people of everything. And in fact, that was, I think, always Descartes' view, and he was always disappointed when it didn't happen, and why he wrote the Meditations and so forth. But did Dan find the answer?
So Dan
No,
has
Dan did
consulted
not,
the index of
because
forbidden books. Yes.
I'm afraid I had mistaken Denziger for the index. Sorry,
You don't have the
Have the-
index.
I don't have that on my shelf. No.
I do think it was lifted for Descartes in the 19th century, but you know,
You
that's
think so?
my recollection. Like, I don't go that far, you know. I don't think about these issues past this, you know, the middle of the 18th, or maybe the beginning of the 18th.
Well, they didn't get as far as Canada.
What is interesting that is that Descartes became a like figure in the 19th century and a sort of symbol of laicism, but he was rediscovered as a Catholic figure in the 12th in the last century with the works of Marion and
Gilson.
Gilson.
and I mean, it was reconsidered as an opening figure for Christianity and for another type of Christian faith.
In just the way that Spinoza was rediscovered as a Jewish philosopher,
Of course, so
which is another strange story.
yes.
Vlad, could you say something about the interaction between Mersenne and Boëthius? If I remember correctly, Mersenne says at some point that Descartes could be the jewel of Christianity. He says that in a letter to Boëthius. Can you say something about that?
Yes, Boëthius had a connection with Mersenne, and he was very good informed about what was the atmosphere in Paris. And there is 2 or 3 letters to Mersenne which were published in the Mersenne correspondence. But I think some of the letters were not anymore accessible, not lost, totally lost. So Descartes want to preserve it. Descartes himself had copies of these letters, which Mersenne gave him. And Descartes wanted to preserve these letters and put the letters on the coffer of La Haye when he went to Stockholm. Why he put the letter there? He wanted the letter to be preserved. So we know some of these letters through copies, but for Descartes it was very important that Descartes replied to Boëthius, and that Boëthius knew that Mersenne was on the side of Descartes.
But how could Voetius think that Mersenne will side with him in the dispute with Descartes?
I mean, it was a point of bonne volonté, bonne foi. I mean, Voetius was not very clean. His arguments were not very clean, and he suggested more than the reality. And Descartes stuck on the truth, on the reality. And for him, it was very important that Mersenne was on the side of Descartes in these polemics. But of course, Mersenne was a very particular figure. He agitated everybody in order to produce objections, replies, intellectual conversation, intellectual disputes. And even if he was on the side of Descartes, he corresponded with Voetius and gave him some information about Descartes. That's clear.
I'd also like to kind of make things a bit more general when we talk about accusation of atheism, that if you look at the end of the century context in England, since you're invoking some of the English context, if you look at the kind of correspondence that happens around, Leibniz-Clark correspondence or the end of the century correspondence of Newtonians, one has the feeling that everyone accuses everyone else of atheism and nothing happens. Not such a big deal. Every single philosopher has been accused of being an atheistic figure or has accused someone else. Meanwhile, at the beginning of the 17th century, you have the feeling that it was very dangerous to be accused of being atheistical. Now, Descartes is in the middle of these two extremes. Was it a real danger for him or not anymore?
Well, probably not being burned at the stake. I'm trying to think of any figure that was burned at the stake after Vanini, which was 1619. I think there was an obscure character I know of in Paris in the early 1620s, who may have been. But can you think of, Roger, Vlad, Steve, Grigore, can you think of anybody who was burned at the stake after, say, the early mid-1620s?
Or killed in other ways. I mean, let's be...
Or killed in other ways, yeah.
Not burned, but cancelled.
Cancelled, yes.
Cancel culture.
Yes, no, absolutely. It was there was
You know what I mean.
Absolutely. There was that. But the thing is, you can still go on living your life, and talking to your friends and thinking you're dangerous.
What was Descartes facing really as danger? Imprisonment or just his books being...
Well, imprisonment, certainly.
Yes.
So the bell rang and he was summoned to the university, I think, to reply to the accusations. And then he got really frightened. But at the same time, he had these high connections. So the French ambassador, the Prince of Orange, and of course, Constantin Huygens. So I'm not sure whether he was really in danger having these connections, but at the same time, he got frightened at some point.
Right. Well, but look, Galileo had high connections as well.
Yeah.
And he was put under house arrest.
Yeah.
He was not executed, but it was still a punishment. On the other hand, it was punishment in comfortable apartments where all of the important people in Europe came to visit him. it underscored his fame and his importance.
But he retracted. Galileo retracted his opinion, but Bruno, who did not retract, was
Right.
burnt.
But
And
that was
in
40 years earlier.
No,
So,
20 in 1600.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so 30,
But Galileo
33
was
years.
condemned in
33.
1632.
Yeah, yes, but he retracted.
But still, Galileo was refused Christian burial. He was buried under a grave with no name on it. How about Descartes? Would have he faced the same kind of thing? No. Or yes?
Well, there are people who suggest that Descartes was poisoned in Stockholm, and that he was poisoned by a Catholic priest, which is very thrilling.
You seem to
No.
find it very amusing, though.
Well, it's ironic because, of course, Queen Christina then converted to Catholicism and went to. I would imagine it would have been a Lutheran minister who might have.
You would poison it? You would poison it?
I don't know, because I mean, that was one of the great victories of Catholicism, was when Christina converted and moved to Italy.
Can I add about the alleged poisoning, that it was supposed to be through the host,
Of course.
and that's how the Catholic could have poisoned Descartes, worrying about his influence on Christina and being negative for their case. But Carroll writes an article saying he would have to have ingested some 400 hosts at the same time, putting a few doubts on the possibility, on the likelihood of that story. It's a really amusing article by Carroll about a review of the book that proposes the poisoning. Sorry to add levity.
Yes, but no, that I've added that for saying that Descartes' death could be viewed as a poisoning. I mean, there was something in the air.
You mean that the gossip was in Europe that maybe someone did him in?
Yes, it was also some medical constatations which were not very clean, and the story of his illness and some details about the stages of this illness were not very clear. And this, of course, nourished the idea that Descartes had not a natural death. So in Stockholm. The fact is that Descartes was not very happy in Stockholm, and he wanted to go back. After 1 or 2 months of happiness, he was not anymore happy. And the atmosphere was black, I think, around him.
And can you tell us why? What was happening there?
I think there was a rivalry. There was a rivalry between the new philosophy and the old philosophy. Also, maybe some medical issues. Descartes was also a little bit doctor. I don't know why, but he was a little bit doctor. And there is an anecdote, as he was ill, the French doctor, the first doctor of the Queen was absent, which was a Frenchman, was absent from the court. And so a Swedish doctor came, who was an old-fashioned guy, with world medicine. And he wanted to do bleeding for Descartes, to have Descartes bleeded. And Descartes is reputed to have said, "Messieurs, épargnez le sang français." I don't know how to translate this in English.
Spare the French blood.
Sir, spare the French blood. So he was against bleeding, against the traditional medical methods. And of course, it was another way of thinking, another way of doing practical medicine, etc., etc. It was not very welcome. And Christina was very occupied as a queen. I think many people around her were saying a lot of things about Descartes, and he had the sensation that he has to leave court.
That he's in danger, or at least, or that he's not wanted.
Maybe. But then he became ill and he died.
Right. By the time the Descartes' philosophy was condemned, he was long dead. But there were Cartesians in France, and not only in France. Did they ever bother to, did this condemnation change something in the evolution of Cartesianism? Did students stop reading Descartes? Did the Cartesians reconsider some of his doctrines?
I frankly think they didn't pay any attention. What's interesting, I think, to when you consider the relations between sort of the Catholic hierarchy in Rome and France. France at that point was moderately independent. I think, somebody can certainly correct me, but I think that cardinals had to be appointed by Rome, but bishops and priests were appointed by the king in France. And judgments even about, for example, the condemnation of Galileo and the condemnation of Copernicanism did not prevent discussions in France. Mersenne had published the what is it, the name of that work in 1632, something or another, and which has a chapter on Copernicanism. He was a little bit cautious, but did not hesitate to publish Galileo's arguments in favor of it after the condemnation. So the fact that Descartes was in any case, putting Descartes on the index doesn't mean that nobody can read it. It means that it's something that only the appropriate people can read. So I don't think it changed. I don't think it changed anything significant.
I'm having in front of me Roger's classic article, Condamnation du Cartesianisme, and I see from here that almost every attack on Descartes was followed by a counter-attack from the Cartesians. So you can have Gabriel Daniel,
Yep.
You can have Ludovico Spru, but you also have Baillet, of course, or Arnaud taking a side with Descartes. So it really was a battle, and each side, when one side gave a satire of Descartes, the other side replied with another satire. So was really a war. Maybe Roger can say more about this. I'm quoting from his article.
So it culminates on Oratorian professors being fired from their teaching for being Cartesians, but the same professors become branchistes in the oratory. You've got Malebranche, who is a well-known Cartesian, and so that they reappear. The same ones who were fired from their teaching at Angers go to Paris and propound Malebrancheism. And so Descartes' philosophy is still well, somewhat changed, but still going forward. And it's the same thing with the quote Jansenists unquote. I mean, they continue. Of course, Arnauld has to go to away from France for a while, and then he returns. So the battles continue. The irony is that Descartes becomes the mainstay of the universities in France around the 1720s, but then by the 1730s, Newton comes around in France, and so the actual height of Cartesianism might have lasted in the universities, might have lasted about 10 years, and then he has to be rediscovered in the 19th century. And turned into something else, a representative of the church or a representative of the kind of the secular. I mean, for a while, the revolutionaries in France thought that Descartes was one of theirs, and they were going to put him in the Pantheon. And then they started looking and finding out that he was not so much a revolutionary, and he couldn't be put in the Pantheon. And so he was put to the side. The battles change. The battles are obviously the battles in the 17th century have to do with Jesuits and Jansenists, and we can all read the Red and the Black, the Rouge and the Noir by Stendhal, and see the battles of the Cartesians and the Jansenists and the Jesuits being reduplicated through French history and literature. And that's where Descartes gets caught in between his old teachers, the Jesuits, and his new posthumous friends, the Oratorians and the Jansenists. So he's part of these movements, and then the movements die off. The Jesuits get expelled from France in the 18th century. The revolution comes around, and then there's a different context for the rebirth of Descartes and the turning Descartes into the father of modern philosophy in a different way than one might have thought in the 17th century. How's that?
If you would have to characterize, if all of you would have to characterize what is at stake in these debates, what are these debates about? Are they about political power, who has the right to define the establishment and who has the right to define who is teaching in the universities? Are they about theology? Are they about what kind of philosophy gets into an alliance with the church? Are they about metaphysics? What are they about?
I think it's more about physics, I would say. Some of Cartesian's assumptions, so the infinity of the world, the unity of the world, I mean, there is one single world, the non-existence of the void, the new idea that all the cosmos is homogeneous, and there are the same elements in sublunar and supralunar. Of course, the new heliocentric model, which was not a finding of Descartes, but Descartes was very convinced about it. It was not a theology. I mean, the theological aspects were more pretexts. And as a proof, I would argue of the position of Arnaud. Antoine Arnaud, the great Arnaud, was a very central figure of the Catholic Church of the Paul Royal. Paul Royal was a very rigorist movement, very close to the core of the faith, and Arnaud was totally Cartesian. So Arnaud could not viewed nothing in Descartes who were a mistake from a theological point of view. He had, of course, some questions. There is some letters to Arnaud and some letters of Descartes who responds to Arnaud's letters. But in general, Arnaud has a Cartesian position. So I think the theological objections were more a pretext of people who want not Descartes to become a leading figure. Now, of course, of intellectual institutional establishment, university, but not only university, maybe also Jesuit college. Descartes tried to become a regular curriculum in Jesuit colleges. So at this level, it was a political, institutional political issue. But for general people, I think it was more a natural philosophy and maybe also a medical issue, as I said. Descartes made experiments on dead bodies, maybe also on vivisections on animals. And he had some new insights about human body. He was a tenant of the circulation of the blood. Voetius in the Admiranda Methodus says that the circulation of the blood is something ridiculous. So Harvey was not yet accepted. So this is a stake, I think.
So debates were not about theology, you are saying, Dan?
I would put it a little differently. Steve has a comment as well he wants to make, but I would put more of the emphasis on the political. By the end of the century, in the beginning of the century, there were a whole group of people, so-called novatores, who were attempting to challenge the authority of the schools, the church, which were also interconnected with governmental institutions. Roger pointed out even Louis XIV got into the act of condemning Descartes. But because all of these institutions were interconnected, there was a challenge to the authority of, these people to sort of set the agenda for what it is that people learned, what it is that people believed. They had a certain status in society, and they saw this being threatened. Descartes, by the end of the century, had become the face of the new philosophy. He was not the only new philosopher, but in a certain way, he stood in for the idea of people challenging the authority of the university, the authority of the church, the authority of the civil authorities to determine, natural philosophy, medicine, and to a certain extent, theology, to dominate the discussions. And this is true in Catholic countries and Protestant countries. And that's, I think, what a lot of the debate was about, who has the authority. And when you look at the pamphlets that people were writing for and against, particularly against the new philosophers in the plural, not only Descartes, but other people who had challenged the authority. It was an enormous thing, to say, these people, these upstarts can't come and overthrow this system that has been, established for so long, in a certain way since the 13th century. And it was an enormous challenge. And this is, I think, the sense in which Descartes is the representative of the modern, which is to say, the freedom of thought, the freedom of expression, and against the authority of institutions, like the church, the university, the civil government. Though Vlad is absolutely right, there was also, for Descartes, there were debates about specific issues as well. But behind that, I think, was the question of.
But Dan, what you are saying is very interesting. Of course, I mean, there are some novatores, but do you think that Descartes was in favor of free speech or free thinking?
No, absolutely not.
I mean, I think he was a very dogmatic figure.
No. He was afraid. He was not. Well,
not in favor of the freedom of the speech. I mean, if you have some figures as Gassendi or as the figure in the southern France, the skeptical milieus and more relaxed figures. Yes, we can speak of freedom of speech, but Descartes.
But he was not. But he certainly was not in favor of, say, the university and the church determining what. I mean, he was in favor. What he would say is, "I'm in favor of reason, and everybody has reason." Of course,
especially me.
Exactly. Of course, insofar as people are rational, they will agree that I am right.
Yes.
but I think, the rhetoric, at least, of the discourse on the method is to take the authority away from the university. I mean, think of the part one, the opening sentence, good sense is so well distributed in the world that nobody thinks that, and that in a certain way is a summary of the Cartesian philosophy. We all have this capacity to discover the truth for ourselves, and that we shouldn't give authority to anybody else, particularly not the schools. But of course, when we follow reason, this is the philosophy. My philosophy is what it is that they will follow. But you shouldn't accept it on authority, on my authority. You should go through the process of the meditation to expose reason and become convinced for yourself.
To become a Cartesian.
Exactly. But not become a Cartesian, become a rational person, which happens to be coextensive with being a Cartesian.
Of course. There is two positions in Descartes which are contradictory. One position is in the Discours de la Méthode, when he says that everybody can collaborate, cooperate in order to do great things and to prolong life, etc. And then there is another position in the late Descartes, which says everybody is abusing me and tiring me, and I need space and freedom to do things and not to be bothered by other people. And so it's not a very cooperative model there. But the two positions are in Descartes and very contradictory.
They're right next to each other in part 6 of the discourse. At the very end of the discourse, he begins with this diatribe against the university and how we each have to go out on our own and discover the truth. Then he outlines what it is that he's discovered, and in the end, you know, there's a little bit of an introduction to the actual treatises. And he says, well, but look, we need to know a whole lot more. We need a lot more experiments. We need a lot more observations. We need a lot more thinking about these things. If any of you have done any experiments, please send me the results. Actually, please don't do that, because most people can't do these things as well as I can. Just send me money and I will do them.
Yes.
And that's exactly the same. That's exactly the same. One right next to another. But he was very arrogant. On the other hand, he did wonderful things too.
I think we sort of have to conclude our discussion tonight. We have about 7 more minutes. So my question in conclusion to you, my question to you would be, how is this much richer story that we have told tonight affecting our current reading of Descartes' philosophy? So what we have learned tonight, in what way what we have learned tonight should modify the way we go to read the Descartes discourse or Descartes meditation tomorrow morning?
I think it's very important to think that Descartes was a work in progress. I think a sort of work in progress from the Discours de la méthode, which was intended to be open to objections and to replies. Initially, he has had to be published with objections and replies, but this project was not accomplished. And then the meditations, of course, the same thing. And then the great effort of Descartes to answer all the letters which he had from other people. Show us that he was very open to discussion, and as Dan has said, was very convinced that his reason and reason in general has to be attained and convince people. And what have we learned this evening? I think we have learned that philosophy has no chance to be accepted by people if philosophers are not open to society and to students and to professors also for answering objections and commentaries. And I think in this respect, our modernity is very Cartesian. So we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have WhatsApp, we have Dana Jalobeanu in order to put us together and to comment and to exchange ideas. This is the great lesson, Descartes' great lesson, I think.
Dan?
What I would take away is that you can't take a text and read it in isolation. that a good deal, I think, of the meaning of the text, the importance, the significance of the text, is who it was written for, who it was written against, what the context of the discussion was. The way in which, in part, sort of contingent circumstances sort of shape the history of the text and its acceptance, and even to a certain extent its meaning. I mean, we didn't go into a lot of detail about the actual discussions that were being conducted, but they really did shape what it is that Cartesianism meant, and that if we don't look at these texts, and not just Descartes, but I think any interesting philosophical text, in its intellectual, social, and political context, then we're missing something important about it. And I'm hoping that maybe if people are interested in going back to Descartes, they might begin to look at some of the literature that puts Descartes into into that larger context. And here I would recommend, first of all, some of Roger's work, since he's sitting here.
Good. Grigore, how about you?
I'm thinking about this idea stemming somehow from Dan, that in order to become popular, you have to be condemned. Or that great philosophers are bound to be condemned, right? Like Galileo, Spinoza, and now we have Descartes. But at the same time, we have a movement like Newtonianism, which becomes popular without being condemned. So, in a sense, I'm trying to understand what was with Newtonianism. Became popular because of its truth, or is this metaphysical speaking? So I end up with being unsure about this. What about you, Dana? Can you draw a conclusion?
I was wondering how I'm going to go tomorrow and reread the beginning of the discourse, because we've been talking a lot about Descartes' metaphysics, but not enough about his scientific treatises, and he published them anonymously together with the discourse, kind of early on, as if science itself is dangerous, not only his metaphysics.
Yeah.
So maybe there is something in what Grigore said, that you first have to be condemned and then you impose your ideas. I don't know.
Yeah, but look, Newtonianism was accepted in a way for its truth,
Yeah.
right?
No, I think that you're absolutely right. I think the case of Newton is different from the case of Descartes.
Roger, what do you think?
Could I add that Leibniz tried to have Newton condemned because he thought he was very dangerous and that nobody should be following Newton. He just didn't have any real clout or anything, but as you see, you can find those cases too.
Yeah, so once church didn't have enough power, philosophers tried to excommunicate each other. That's not a very, very happy conclusion for our discussion tonight, but it has to be a conclusion. Thank you very much for this lovely evening.
Thank you very, very much,
It's
Donna.
wonderful
This
to
was
spend
lovely.
it with you. Take care.